to know at the end of year 12. So I'm assuming that most of the audience here will be people who've just completed lower sixth in the UK system and are now starting to think about what they're going to do next year. And I really want to explain a little bit more about how an application strategy for the UK and for abroad meshes together. And what kind of things you need to think about if you go to university abroad that perhaps not relevant if you're studying in the UK, and vice versa. But before I get stuck into that in too much detail, I will just introduce myself briefly. I mean, who am I and why do I feel qualified to talk about this? Well, essentially, we've been helping British students go to universities abroad, predominantly in Europe, but also further afield, for about 2 decades now. We didn't start out as experts in sort of medicine and those kind of fields, but it's fair to say that in the years we've been doing this, many more people are interested in the health sciences than any other branch of study. Why is that? Well, rather obviously, it's because of the pressure to get places in the UK, either in terms of the grades required or the sheer lack or minimal number of places that are available. So we're in a position where we can provide you with information about what your options are. And in certain cases, we can assist you in a little bit more detail. But today I'm going to talk in general terms. A little bit later, I will introduce to you the medical schools that we work with. But I'd like to think that everything we're going to talk about today is more or less relevant and good advice across wherever you might want to study. So I'm going to start with the most important thing to consider when looking at studying medicine abroad, and that is it for you? Obviously, we get a lot of people who are very, very keen on becoming doctors. And if it doesn't work out in the UK, they just think, well, I still want to be a doctor. What am I going to do? I know I'll go abroad. Well, it's not the same thing. You do have to be mindful of the fact that you're going to be living in another country for probably minimum 6 years. And that is going to mean a period of adjustment. It means you are going to probably have to learn a new language. The extent to which you have to learn a language does vary a little bit from country to country, but I would never advocate that you go into this without being, without thinking about learning a language. You also need to give some thought to where it is you want to work after graduation. Where you qualify might very well have an impact on where you go on to work. We quite often get people who are interested in working in the United States, and while going to study there for that particular purpose doesn't make a huge amount of sense, let's be honest, there are pathways that you can take which might be more suited to going to work in the US than elsewhere. We are obviously going to return to this subject quite a bit later on when talking about working in the UK, because there have been some very, very important changes. I am not sure how much information you've been getting about this from people representing international medical schools. So I want to make sure you know all about this. And I will be talking about this in some detail a little bit later on. The next thing that's relevant to you or specific to you is obviously the grades and subjects you have at A-level or Leaving Cert or Scottish Highers or whatever it happens to be. You need to make sure that you've got sensible subjects. Otherwise, there's not really much point in applying abroad. If you don't have the right grades or the right subjects to access the best options right now, you might be better off advised to take a gap year and try again in a little while. Now, another thing which is very specific to you, which is going to, for most people, be a limiting factor, I imagine, is money. Do you have the money to pay for it? Okay, not everybody does. Not every option is affordable for every wallet. We'll give you a bit of an indication as to what kind of fees you're letting yourself in for later on in this webinar, but it's always a good idea to contact us for the most up-to-date information about options you're interested in. And if you have a particular budget in mind, you can let us know and we'll see if it's doable or not. Now, again, I said the reason why we're doing this presentation for those of you who've just completed year 12 is because this is the ideal moment, I would suggest, for you to start researching your options, okay? Over this summer holiday, I think it's a good idea for you not only to look at what's going on in the UK and come back in September knowing full well what you're going to do, but also think about your plan B and which universities you might be interested in going to abroad. Now, what kind of things should you be looking at when you're looking at the various medical schools in Europe? Well, here are a few suggestions. How do medical schools teach? You will already know that in the UK, different medical schools have different ways of working, different times at which clinical exposure starts. Some universities will be focused on problem-based learning. Oral exams are a big part of life in most Central European countries, so Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. You might have oral exams, which are obviously very unusual for people coming from a British background. And then in other countries such as Italy, negative marking is a big thing, meaning that you might come across for the first time in your life somebody taking points off you for a wrong answer rather than just leaving it at a zero. British students do not tend to like that, but it's a fact of life. It's not you're being singled out for special treatment. Language requirements, again, these can vary tremendously from one country to the next. Think about the level at which you will have to learn the language, and also think about the ease of learning the language. It might be the case that, say, something like Spanish or Italian is easier than learning Polish or Bulgarian, for example. Then also take a moment to consider when the practical years will happen and where they will happen. Some medical schools will enable you to take years 5 and 6, essentially, back in the UK or elsewhere. Okay. Other times that option will not be available to you. I think actually, as far as doing your practical years in the UK goes, that is going to get tougher. So what's on offer today might not be on offer in the future. Okay. But do think about that, because that will again have an impact on where you learn the language, how long you're going to be spending time abroad, etc., etc. Now, quite aside from these factors, you do also need to bear in mind that you are talking about choosing somewhere to live for the next 6 or so years of your life. So you want to pay some attention to your quality of life. Make sure you're going somewhere that is safe, friendly, has good student support. Maybe you'd be interested to know how many other British students are there, not because I particularly regard that as critically important, but because it's good to know that there is at least a community there you can join in with. Okay. Term times abroad are often very, very different. Well, they're always different from in the UK. In Europe, most universities will work on a semester system, which means that your Christmas and Easter holidays will be very short. You'll have a mid-year gap between the 2 semesters, which won't really correspond to any known holiday in the UK, and that will be probably in late January, early February. And the Christmas holidays, unfortunately, you're going to be spending a large amount of that time revising for exams that are going to happen in January. So your life is going to be very different. Your holidays are going to be very different. Accommodation, I've mentioned this here because some of the options, some of the universities we've seen over the years, they have their own accommodation, but it's not up to the standard you would be expecting. So do investigate. If something looks cheap, it quite possibly isn't going to be something that's going to meet your expectations. And talking about cheap and money, again, do consider the overall cost, do define your budget and stick to it. Now, another question for universities, and this one's quite difficult to get an answer to. I would suggest that the other things I've mentioned here are quite easy for you to figure out, okay? But graduation rates can be a little bit harder, but are supremely important. You need to know not just how many people a university takes in any one year, but how many graduate on time 6 years later. Okay, most medical degrees in Europe are 6 years. The reason why this is important, obviously, is because you're investing your time, your money in getting a qualification. And if people are taking 7, 8, 9, even more years to graduate, that is going to have an impact on when you start working, when you're able to pay back any loans you've taken out. And also, it's going to represent a loss of earning potential if it's taking you extra time. Now, in many European countries, dropout rates might appear quite high. And this is not always a bad thing, because it's a fact of life in many countries. Many people will go to university with the expectation that it's going to be tough and will drop out along the way. Now, I know that is far less common to somebody looking at this from a UK perspective, but it is, a fact of life that, the dropout rates will never be comparable to those in the UK. Now, okay, telling you what to find out and telling you to go to speak to the university or speak to somebody like me to get that kind of information about universities is all well and good, but there are, of course, other sources of information out there. All of them, to be honest, are good. All of them come with drawbacks. Okay. Naturally enough, you're going to want to speak to current students because they'll be the ones to tell you what it's like to go to that university right now. Their information will be pretty much up to date. but their experience will not be yours. It never can be, okay? So do take anything they say with a pinch of salt, particularly if it relates to their personal circumstances, okay? So it can be difficult to get meaningful information from students. But of course, I'm never going to say don't speak to them. Of course not. Also speak to doctors or maybe vets, if you're looking at vet school, who've qualified abroad. They will be able to share their experience, okay? But do also bear in mind that if you're talking to people who graduated 10 years ago and they tell you that their med school was the best or is the best in Europe, many new ones have opened up since then. So they won't necessarily have an accurate picture on what your options are today. So you'll be getting out-of-date information, good information, but you might be able to get better elsewhere. But other sources of information that I regard as even less accurate, shall I say, are online forums, okay? If I were a nicer person, I could dedicate my entire life to correcting things that are on Reddit and the student room, which are frankly nonsense, or regurgitated information from 10 years ago that's no longer relevant. I do not believe a word or do not put any faith into anything I read in these forums, and I suggest that you don't either, primarily because I've just seen so much information there that's either downright wrong or is so personally specific that it can't possibly be of any use to anybody else, but people felt they should publish it as if they have some kind of inside track on everything going on at a particular university. So be very, very careful about online forums. Now, the final source of information is one that I imagine you possibly already have slightly negative feelings towards, and that is agents. But agents serve a purpose in this, okay? I should say that sometimes we work as an agent. It's not necessarily something that I really enjoy, but it's sometimes something I have to do because that's what universities want. That's the way they want to work with us, okay? So we don't really have any choice. Other times I'll work as a consultant. If I work as a consultant, I have to charge you a fee for my advice because I'm not getting paid any other way. But why should you talk to agents? Well, think of it from my perspective, okay? I've been doing this nearly 20 years. I've been lied to by more universities than you will ever speak to. I've also been lied to by more applicants, and and I've had much more insight into what makes a good, strong application and what doesn't. So we can help you identify what is possible, what is sensible, and stop you from potentially wasting your time and money. So a lot of people feel that they can do this by themselves, and that, maybe you can, but actually, you know what? It doesn't actually cost you any more to necessarily work with an agent. Obviously, if you're talking to agents who are trying to point you in the direction of universities which are in countries which are of dubious quality, the most obvious example of that right now would be somewhere like Georgia, I would advise you to run a mile. There are some very, very dodgy agents out there and a lot of sharp practice. So you do have to take anything you hear from an agent with a pinch of salt. But at the same time, I can assure you that we will tell you exactly who we work with, exactly what our relationship is, and exactly how much it will cost before you decide whether or not to go forward. And then you can take an informed decision as to whether you want our input or not. Now, talking about how you're going to go about your application strategy and how you're going to put this into effect in year 13. The first thing I would suggest we've got to consider, the thing that makes a major difference is whether you're applying in the UK or not. Okay. If you're not applying in the UK, then we've got nothing to worry about. Jump straight into foreign applications. If you are applying in the UK, you do need to give that your full consideration before you start looking at applying to universities abroad. Please don't wait to research your options abroad. Do that over the summer holidays, but pushing the button on an application for medical school, look, the earliest you're going to need to do that in Europe is probably around Christmas time. There is no great rush to get started on this in September, October. So you've got enough time to get into the UCAS system, okay? Now, I would advise you when deciding if you're going to apply in the UK or not, to be brutally honest in assessing your chances. If your GCSEs or your predicted grades or your UCAT score don't support an application, you know what? You might be better off not bothering and waiting and potentially applying when they do, if they ever do support an application in the UK. But the grades required They're not as insanely high, the UCAT score or the A levels, as they once were, perhaps. And they're not as high as perhaps they are for dentistry these days. And also, the pressure for places in medicine is not quite the same as what it is in dentistry. So, for a dentist, I'd be advising them maybe they need to do things before they even apply in the UK. For you, you definitely don't. The earliest you would need to apply realistically would be around February, okay, for the earliest options. The reason why I said December is because for that particular university, you're going to have to plan to take the entrance exam, and that is best done with, good time. Okay, I'm going to talk more about entrance exams in a moment. And again, so coming back to this idea of applying both in the UK and abroad at the same time, the main reason why we don't suggest that you start applying abroad until after you know what's going on in the UK is because, firstly, it might be a waste of time, and secondly, it might cost you money. So what I'd advise you to do is not look for any similarity between UK and European admissions, because it just isn't there. Pretty much every university in Europe has their own individual application process. Only some countries have centralized admissions for their medical schools, Italy being the best example of that. Now, obviously, you already know that 15th of October is your application deadline in the UK. If you get rejections quite quickly, I know it's not what you're going to want, but it's relatively easy for us to help you because you're still early enough for us to get you in anywhere. If you get rejections after interview, say that would take us through to possibly March, April, then some options will be gone. And if you're having to wait until May to find out, then more options will be gone, but there will still be options available to you. We have been able to help students this year get into Cyprus even until a few weeks ago. It's now getting tricky because if you need a visa, we're already, well, basically into July, so it's getting a bit tough to get that in time. But we can assist you in applying to Cyprus at around this time next year, up to about this time. If you get an offer in the UK, but the worst happens on results day and you're not able to take that offer up, it's very unlikely we'd be able to get you into any of the medical schools we work with directly, but there will still be options in some places in Central Europe. Some universities in the Czech Republic, one in Bulgaria, have entrance exams which are designed for people who end up in exactly that situation. But I would suggest that if those options don't appeal to you, don't feel you need to rush into it. A gap year is most definitely not the end of the world. Use a gap year perhaps to get into the university of your dreams rather than the one that happens to be available next August. So that's how you need to think about your application strategy. The next thing I want to look at is what grades do you need to get in? Now, obviously, if we're talking about a whole bunch of universities in Europe, they're very different. Okay, so the entry requirements might differ tremendously. What I'm giving you here are my sort of general guidelines as to when you should apply and when you definitely shouldn't. If you get grades of A, B, or better, including biology, chemistry, and something else, then most options in Europe will be available to you. If you get above 3 Cs, there are places where we can help you apply. If you get below 3 Cs, please don't do it, okay? There might be some foundation years we could put forward for you, but you might be better off resitting. The advantage of resitting over foundation years is that foundation programs are tied to the university where you do it. So yes, you could go abroad and do a foundation program, but if you find out you don't like that university, you're stuck because you can't use that foundation program to transfer to anywhere else. Whereas if you improve your A-level grades, well, yeah, every university in Europe will consider that. Okay, but there are genuine reasons why I would encourage foundation years in certain circumstances. They might very well be the right way forward, but more often than not, resitting is a viable way to go about this. In some countries, you can get a conditional offer or indeed an unconditional offer based purely on predicted grades. Okay, so that is possible. Some countries in Europe, you're not going to be able to apply until you've actually got your grades. Romania is like this. Germany, for example, there's public universities in Germany, private universities will look at you. But if you find yourself, wanting to go to those countries, you need to be prepared to take a gap year, I would suggest. A final point on BTECs and access to HE qualifications in the UK. These are not really considered for medical school entry anywhere in the European Union. You might find one or two exceptions, but in my experience, they might say that they would accept you with these qualifications, but in reality, they possibly won't actually do so. But you definitely can't use them in Italy, Bulgaria, for example. Now, those are the things that universities do consider as part of the application process. Here are some things which they're unlikely to consider. Interviews. Some universities will interview, but the vast majority don't. UCAT scores, useful information, but not really important, although there are some universities which will exempt you from entrance exams if you have a decent UCAT score. European universities are not looking to see how much work experience you've got, nor are they interested in extended project qualifications, okay? These are great things to have. I'm not saying don't get them, but I will say they don't help with an application in Europe. Personal statements or motivation letters and academic references. Some universities, yes. Most universities, not really, okay? You would need them for universities in Cyprus, for example. I've never come across anybody needing them for Italy. Croatia is a little bit more mixed, and Poland might be a bit mixed as well. But generally speaking, they're not going to be as important as they are in the UK. There's no point sweating blood and tears over a personal statement for a European dental school or a medical school admission. But I did briefly mention entrance exams, and obviously I'm going to come back to this and speak about it in a little bit more detail, because these are the biggest tool that universities use when selecting students for medical degrees in Europe. Most universities will have their own medical exam, entrance exam. There are one or two sort of exams which are common and can be used for lots of different medical schools. But actually, if you apply to, say, 3 or 4 medical schools, you're probably going to have to prepare for 4 different entrance exams. Now, in terms of travel, that's typically not a problem because you can often do these online these days. In terms of preparation, it can be a bit of a nightmare because every university has a different curriculum that they use. And you might very well find there are some things on the entrance exam that do not actually correspond to anything that's been in your A-level biology chemistry curriculum. Now, most exams will include biology and chemistry as a matter of course. Some will include maths and or physics, and others might include, logical, spatial, verbal reasoning, much like you'd see on the UCAT. Now, what I will say about entrance exams is these are important for you to get into a medical school often, but they are not so important that you should be thinking, well, actually, I'm going to do these and jeopardize my A-levels, okay? Don't, whatever you do, schedule an entrance exam at the same time as really important A-level preparation, okay? Sometimes there are a lot of medical schools that have entrance exams around March and April, and unless you're dead set on that being your number one pick, I wouldn't bother. Largely because most of them will still have entrance exams in July or possibly even later after you've finished your A-levels. And for the universities that don't, for example, the ones we work in Italy, I actually usually recommend that you only apply to those during a gap year because the entrance exam preparation needs to be quite intense if you're going to get a place there. Okay, so entrance exams, unfortunately, going to be a factor of your life. As I've already covered I've already covered this slide a little bit, I'm afraid, telling you what they include. They're usually multiple choice, and sometimes you have to travel to universities to take them, but more often than not, you don't. Now, what about other ways that you might be able to get into medicine, either here or abroad? Because if you're looking at plans B through C, D, E, or whatever, studying abroad might only be one of them. You might also be tempted to look at other things you could do. I'm just going to briefly mention these. Foundation years can be good in the UK or abroad. Like I said before, they do tend to tie you to the university where you're doing your foundation, so they're not much use if you change your mind about where you want to study. The one thing I will say about foundation years, and we have a very, very clear rule about this, is we will not work with a foundation program if it does not guarantee a place in the first year if completed successfully. If you do a foundation year and that gives you the chance to apply, Sorry, not good enough. Okay. I wouldn't waste your time on it. Unfortunately, that's quite common with British university foundation years. So be very, very careful. There's nothing worse than keeping your end of the bargain and then finding out there isn't actually a place available for you anyway. BSc Biomed Science. I mean, obviously, a lot of you, when your fifth choice on the UCAS is going to be for Biomed Science, and that might keep an open pathway into graduate entry upon completion of your Biomed Science, put you on a sort of 7-year trajectory. It's a good route, but again, it doesn't come with a guarantee. So I wish it did. Now, unfortunately, if you do a biomed science degree and you can't get into grad entry and then you start looking at universities abroad, you are not going to get any credit recognition for your biomed science degree. And if somebody does offer you that, be very careful indeed. The scandals or difficulties that the GMC has reported around recognition of foreign degrees, if you go on the GMC website and look at their black and grey list, you will see there are various universities there where they won't accept students who've come from there. And usually it's people who've been on some kind of pretend graduate entry program or where they've had significant amounts of credits recognized from other universities on other degrees. Now, if you do find yourself needing to move between medical schools in Europe and the EU, it's usually possible if you're studying medicine in the UK to transfer into medicine abroad. It's also possible to move between EU medical schools. It is very, very rare indeed. And in fact, I've never actually seen it for somebody to start abroad and transfer back into a UK medical school. There just simply aren't the places available for that, and it's never happened. So quite often we get asked by people who are like, can I start abroad and then come back to the UK at some point? Unfortunately, you can't. This is very different from, say, Germany and France, where a lot of French and German students go abroad in the expectation that they'll be able to go home after 2 or 3 years. Unfortunately, for British nationals, that's just not going to happen. So now where can you go and look? Where should you be directing your research? Well, by our estimate, there are approximately 85 medical schools in Europe. It might be a little bit higher than that because we are aware of 1 or 2 new universities that have launched. The country where the new ones have been launching is Greece for some reason. But basically, Italy has the most medical schools, 18 of them at last count. About 4 of these are private and 14 of them are public. Obviously, private means more money than the public ones. Come back to fees a little bit later. Poland has a lot of medical schools, including some very good ones in Wrocław, Jagiellonia and Krakow, Poznan, Gdansk, Warsaw. So there are definitely places we'd recommend there. Czech Republic has 8 schools of medicine, some of them very, very good indeed, definitely worthy of your consideration. And Bulgaria has 6 medical schools, of which I would say 3 are, possibly 4 if we include Pleven as well, are worthy of your consideration. The others, perhaps not. I would stick with Varna, Plovdiv, Medical University Sofia, and maybe Medical University Pleven if you are looking at Bulgaria. There are also options, of course, in Cyprus and in most of the Baltic states. There are very few, indeed now, not really any in Western Europe. Spain doesn't really have any medical schools teaching in English, lots of dentistry schools, but nothing for medicine. So these are the main countries I would encourage you to look at. Now, coming on to the fees, obviously, as I've mentioned before, you'll be paying for this by yourself. So you need to make sure that you can afford it. Okay. Now, what are the relative fees going to be? Well, a lot of people are attracted to Italy because it is cheap. The 4,620 euros I've put there is the most you would end up paying. This is what you would pay if you were a non-EU national, i.e. a British student. But if you have an EU passport, it might even be significantly cheaper than that, depending on your family's income. A lot of people are very, very keen on going to Italy. The admission process for the public universities is unfortunately a bit of a nightmare. So it's difficult. You might need to take a gap year to make it work. The entrance exam takes place in September for courses starting in October. If you are lucky enough to get a place, you will then have to get a visa if you are British, and that at such short notice cannot be done. You are going to miss the first few weeks of term at least. Okay. The countries which offer the most affordable, sensible routes in, I would say, are Romania and possibly more for for British students, Bulgaria, where it's around 10,000 euros a year. These are sensible routes. There are places like Georgia where it will be cheaper than that, but please don't go there under any circumstances. It just will be a waste of time and money, even though it's cheaper. Okay, Czech Republic and Poland, fees there do vary depending on which university you're looking at, but they start from around 12 to 15,000 euros a year. Cyprus, there are 2 medical schools we work with there. Their fees are around about 23,000, but I would say that the environment there is a lot more similar to perhaps what you'd find at a UK medical school, and therefore it might very well be worthy of your consideration. There's a reason why paying these fees is worthwhile. Same thing with the Italian private universities, where fees are now around 18 to 20,000. I would suggest if you can afford the private fees, then this is the best way for you to go. I'm going to skip over veterinary medicine tonight because I don't think there's many people in here who are interested in that. You're welcome to get in touch if I've misjudged you or if you're seeing this at a later date online. The next question I want to come on to is one that's very, very important. It relates to the recognition of EU qualifications post-Brexit. Now, unlike with dentistry, where there is a massive potential looming problem with this, with medicine, there is no problem really with recognition of EU qualifications. The introduction of the UK MLA means that theoretically all medical schools are equal and everybody has to take this licensing exam before they're allowed to go into practice. Right now, actually, if you have an EU medical degree, you can't actually be forced to take the UK MLA because that would be a restriction on your right to practice, and you can actually go into practice easier, although I'm going to contradict that in a moment. It was easier than if you qualified from a British medical school, which is obviously quite a nonsensical situation, and it is beginning to change. But don't worry really about the quality of education you're going to get. The thing you really need to worry about is this. Now, this is new for this year's presentation, and I hope that you all know about it, but I am reassured that you definitely all will know about it by the end of this session. And this is the main thing that I wanted to talk about today that is making a lot of changes, okay? There was a bill passed a couple of months ago now, 3 months ago, in March, the Medical Training Prioritization Act. Now, this is starting to come into effect this year and will be fully in effect by next year. And basically what it means is that non-UK educated medicine graduates will be disadvantaged when it comes to foundation and specialist training places, and UK graduates will be prioritized. Now, that includes foreigners studying at UK medical schools, but you studying abroad as a Brit will be behind them in the queue. Now, why has this law come in? Well, you probably know about the shortage of particularly foundation year 1 and 2 placements, and also for early career specialization and so on. There's something like 40,000 people applying for 10,000 places every year. And to get that backlog down, they're going to deprioritize anybody coming from outside the United Kingdom, with the exception of Ireland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland. I think that's it. There's a handful of countries which will be exempted from this. But it does mean that if you wanted to come back and work within the NHS, life is going to get a whole lot harder. This article here is from the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't seen that, that's just one example of the kind of situation that you're going to find yourself in. And unfortunately, I would suggest that this might mean that going to study medicine abroad, if your plan is to work in the NHS, it's going to be harder than it ever was. Now, what are the consequences of this? If you can't come back and do FY12 in the UK, well, basically, you're going to have to do that in the country where you are studying. And if you are in an EU country but not an EU citizen, I cannot guarantee you're going to have the rights to training places in the country where you are studying either. You need to check that out for each individual country. And obviously, also, if you are practicing in a country in the EU and you're going to register as a doctor there, you're going to need to be able to speak the language fluently. You're not going to be able to just bluff your way through, which, to be honest, sometimes you can, when you're going through medical school. So this is going to have a major impact, and you need to be aware of it. Now, obviously, if you're not convinced you want to come back to the UK anyway, this is not something that I would advise you to worry about in too much detail. But because of the outside role that the NHS plays in medicine in the UK, it is going to have a real impact. This is another article about exactly this thing, which comes from the Times Higher Education and a couple of months ago now, and does give a little bit more information about what this means about your chances of getting the foundation program. Now, obviously, if you need to get URLs for these articles, I'll be happy to send them out to you, but hopefully, you've got enough information here, or you've got enough information for you to do some research into this. But please research this. If you speak to an agent who downplays this, seriously, it is a big deal. And anybody telling you it isn't, yeah, you've got to wonder what else they're telling you isn't a big deal, which actually is as well. Okay. So where can we help you apply? I did say I'd mention some options. Again, for veterinary medicine, we've got 3 schools that we work with. For human medicine, the main universities that we work with are in Italy, Cyprus, Croatia, and in Poland. We don't work with everybody. That is a strategic decision because we can't spread ourselves that thinly. And also, we don't want to be helping people apply to 4 or 5 different medical schools. We'd rather establish whether there's a match between our schools and you. And if there is, we will go forward on a kind of no-win, no-fee basis. So we don't tend to charge people money up front. The only money you would have to pay to apply to any of the universities we represent would be the application fee, which I think the highest one for universities we work with is around €200 for those that have entrance exams that you need to take. Some of the others, like in Poland, it's only about €40, something like that. So, actually really cheap to apply. You shouldn't be handing over large chunks of money to anybody just to apply to a university or just to access sample test papers. That is a nonsense. If you find yourself speaking to an agent who wants a load of money for that, then you can do better. Give us a call. Okay. I will just point out a little bit about when I was talking about strategy, about when you apply where, if you've got like a plan A, plan B, plan C, if your first choice doesn't work out, we can then move on to plan B or plan C within reason, because some universities will have earlier deadlines than other. In the context of the universities you're seeing here on this slide, the one way you have to apply earliest is definitely Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, one of the top medical schools in Europe. Their entrance exam happens every year in late February, early March, and you will know by mid-April if you've gotten a place or not. Now, by mid-April, all of the other universities I've put up here will still definitely have places available for you. So if it doesn't work out there, we can move on to the next ones. I can also say with some of the med schools that we worked with, particularly the ones in Cyprus, we will have a greater than 90% certainty of whether or not you're going to be accepted before we even start the process. With Italy, I don't have any certainty at all. And with Poland and with Croatia, I have guidelines, but, they can change. Okay, so that, I hope, gives you a bit of an insight as to where we work, how we work, and what kind of things you need to bear in mind when you are delivering or putting together a strategy for applications alongside UK or instead of UK applications. You are welcome to contact us anytime. Please visit our website. There's loads of information about medicine on there. Email, Twitter, etc., etc. You can contact us at any time. But the purpose of this webinar is really just to answer whatever questions